Hi, and welcome back. This is Disability Saves the World with Dr. Félix. I am Félix. This podcast brings you insights from leading experts in disability and math studies from around the world. You'll hear about the research and work of disabled scholars, activists, artists, and our allies. You'll also get some insight into their lives, their favorite non-DS activities, hobbies, and adventures. Most importantly, you'll hear how they think disability can save the world. My name again is Félix. I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as a fat, disabled, cis man of color. On today's show, I'm joined by Dr. Jeffrey Preston. Jeff, who uses he, him pronouns, is an assistant professor in the Disability Studies program at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario. Jeff most recently provided testimony on Canada's response to COVID as it relates to disability to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. His opening remarks have been shared widely online and reflect in many ways what differently embodied and in-minded people are feeling and experiencing during this health crisis. I'm excited to speak with him about his work.
What I'm working on right now is trying to dig out a sense of analysis, a way of doing work around internet memes and disability.
His life outside of academia.
I love video games. I'm really deep into video games, love it. But there's just something beautiful about loading up NHL and just knowing that you just eviscerated like a 12-year-old. But there's just no better feeling. And there's no better reality check than when the 12-year-old completely humiliates you.
And of course, to ask him how he thinks disability can save the world. Hi, Jeff. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm so glad that we get this opportunity to chat. I wanted to jump right into what I call segment one. This is inside the research, the project, the work, the art. I wanted to ask you, as a first question, why disability studies?
That's a really good question, and like an enormous question in some ways. And so I think what's probably going to happen a lot during this episode, this is a spoiler alert to the listeners. I tell stories. It's just sort of what I do. And so I'm going to answer your question with a story. And my story goes back a little bit, back to when I was young. So when I was a child, I was scooped up very, very young into the world of charity, into the world of sort of poster boy dumb. So I was 3 years old. I gave like a little thank you speech at a beach volleyball tournament that was raising money for muscular dystrophy, and it kind of splayed off from there into becoming, doing poster child for Muscular Dystrophy Association for a couple of years and getting involved with Easter Seals. And really through all of my childhood and through my high school years, I had these two competing narratives about who I was and what my life was. That in my sort of daily interactions in the world of charity, there were these narratives of tragedy, these narratives of struggle, these narratives of loss. There's a lot of there's some biblical stuff going on there as well, narratives of God and love. Then on the other side, I had my own personal experience, which really contradicted a lot of those experiences, a lot of the things that people said to me. I remember when I was young I was always very awkward when people would say things like, I'm really sorry this happened to you. And I never really knew how to answer that because it didn't reflect how I felt. I wasn't sorry that this had quote unquote happened to me. I didn't feel like anything had happened to me because I was born this way. My form of muscular dystrophy is genetic from birth. And so I always felt kind of awkward. And I realized at a really young age that my responses were really about other people, not about me. That I was like, right, in this moment of interaction, this actually isn't really about me. And that's okay. Like maybe this is why I'm here on this planet. Maybe I can give comfort and aid to these poor people who are really distressed by me for some reason. And so it wasn't until I got to university when I was a little bit of a punk, a little counterculture, loved reading my Adbusters magazine, that I first picked up this book called The Politics of Disablement by Mike Oliver. And I read this thing and it was like a bomb went off in my head. And I realized that these two sort of disjointed, disconnected worlds were suddenly being drawn together and pulled together by, well, by and large, by historical materialist perspective of disability, but more broadly speaking, the social model. I suddenly realized there were people out there that were actually putting words to some of the things that I had been feeling in a way that I had no language to speak, that I had no way of actually putting words to. And so that's sort of what drew me into the field. It was like this sort of almost like a forbidden text, right? Like it was like that moment when, Eve bites into the apple and the forbidden fruit was DS. And I was so ready to be booted out of the garden in some ways and really never looked back from then.
Can I ask, how did you find a copy of Mike Oliver's? Like, how
It was
did you come
sitting on a
across it?
shelf. It was sitting on a shelf in the library at Western.
Hmm.
I was working on a paper. My program had a lot of, we'll say, Marxist adjacent professors, professors that were interested in Marxist criticism and that sort of thing. So I was working on a paper about historical materialism, and it came up on the search. And I was like, politics of disability, politics of disablement. That's really interesting. Pulled it. It was small. I read it in like a day. Um, I do not remember how I did on that assignment because that's not at all what the assignment was about. But who
How
cares?
does it
Who
matter?
cares how that went? It doesn't matter. It set me. It set me on my path. I think for not just the master's work and the doctoral work, but really a career in trying to do my part um, to give back some of my own words in thanks for the words that I got from people like Mike, people like Colin Barnes, people like Tom Shakespeare, people like Rosemary Garland Thompson, Robert McGruer, Jasbir Puar. Like the list just goes on and on and on. And so I felt like the more I read, the more I realized this is something that I really want to be a part of. And I want to give back. I want to give back to the people who made such a difference in my life.
That's wonderful. I want to know, is there a particular kind of topic or project or subject that you want to speak about today? I mentioned in the introduction that you recently were asked to give testimony to Canada's response to COVID in relation to disability. I wonder, I have lots of questions about that. So I wonder if you want to talk about that, or is there something else that you'd like to talk about first?
Yeah. So before we talk about that, because there's some grimness to those conversations. Your viewers won't be able to see because this is a podcast. Hello to everyone from the 21st century with video. Thank you for listening on your. I'm assuming old timey radio at home.
Right.
So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm kind of mocking myself here, but for those of you who cannot see, you should be aware that I'm currently wearing a sweatshirt, which is basically a young boy surfing on a keyboard. I'll let Fatty see so you can enjoy, with the words internet written above it. This is a sweater that was made out of a cover of an old textbook, I believe made in Canada in the 90s to teach children about surfing, quote unquote, on the World Wide Web. And I wore that very intentionally because what I'm working on right now is trying to dig out a sense of analysis, a way of doing work around internet memes and disability. And that's really the direction that my research is taking at the moment. Digital culture and the ways in which we represent disability, the ways that we present, create, construct, imagine disability in digital spaces. And so there's sort of two branches that I'm following. The one branch is about doing really archaeology of mimetic culture and looking at the ways in which tendrils of ableism bind together these what may seem to be these superfluous, just sort of nonsense, fun little memes that we share on the internet that actually give us really interesting access to the zeitgeist on who and what disabled people are and what is and isn't relevant, important, necessary, and real about disability, and how we could sort of dig out some of those things through internet memes. And then the other side is I really like to play with internet scammers, and a lot of internet scammers. I'm at like the perfect intersection for internet scammers because I am a person with a disability. It's very obvious that I have a disability on my social media presence, and scammers target a lot of disabled people, presumed to be easy targets. Yeah, it's a real problem. Um, and I'm also an academic with a publicly posted email address on our faculty website, meaning that I get a ton of emails of people pretending to be colleagues of mine trying to get me to buy gift cards and other various things. So I love to play with scammers. I like to talk to them, befriend them, learn things about them, make them very angry and frustrated. And what was a hobby to start, I guess, has started to grow into a bit of a research interest. I'm starting to untangle a little bit of a web that I believe is, this is still very early days, I should say, but finding what appears to be some sort of bot network that has been created on Facebook using images of disabled people, and it appears to be very actively targeting adding as friends disabled people throughout. And so the other side of the sort of digital culture question is the ways in which the internet is also opening up threat to disabled people, and what types of obligations do services like Twitter, like Facebook, like Instagram, what type of obligations do they have, not just to protect disabled people, quote unquote, but what types of obligations do they have to react very quickly and to prevent the opportunity for people to take advantage of those who are either unaware, unable, or simply don't have the technical sophistication to untangle some of these scams. And so starting to think about the sort of the perils and the positives of digital connection is, I think, kind of lies at the heart of my more recent thrust. But I think what binds all of it together is I'm fascinated by the normate. They are the strangest, most interesting creature, I think, on this planet. And maybe one day I would love to start maybe a form like an institute that we could bring the normates to and give them care, perhaps help them to get through the struggles of normalcy. I think that'd be like the long-term vision, but we're gonna sort out this whole internet memes thing first, and then we'll fix the normates after.
I mean, I've always thought the normates were an illusion, and that none of them actually existed. But
they do in their minds. They do in their minds.
Yeah,
no. They're there. They're out there. They're unorganized. Yes. But they're out there, and in the honor of medical science, I think as academics, it's we are beholden to fix them, to just get in there and resolve their deficiencies. So he says with for those of you who do not know, this is intended to be dripping with just dripping with irony, um, tongue firmly in cheek. Unless you are a wealthy donor and you would like to finance the Normal Institute, I'm not opposed to your money, by all means. I will build a building for these people.
On that note, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what principles or guidelines undergird your work. Is there a particular kind of theoretical perspective, especially when you're thinking about the intersections of disability and technology, or disability and like internet studies, or digital studies?
Yeah.
How do you bring those two things together?
Yeah. I'm a bit of a weirdo. He says, 15 minutes into this. Again, if you hadn't figured that out yet, dear listener. But I love finding theories, and I love finding tools that are typically not necessarily brought together, that aren't necessarily used together. And I like to kind of smash them together and see what comes out. Because ultimately, there is no theory, there is no method that is perfect. There are only tools and ideas that can help us take that next step forward. I think when it comes to internet memes, I've been really, really drawn back to Baudrillard and his writings on simulacra in particular. And I think the concept of simulacra or hyperreality more generally obviously seems extraordinarily ahead of its time now in the world of the internet, where we live within a world of copies of copies of copies. But I think that actually in the world of disability, this very concept is actually very useful in helping us to start to unpack the layers of the representation. Because I think one thing I've learned in my time in the world of media studies, which is really my formal training, is that every representation of disability is nestled within this broader cultural conversation around impairment that is largely representational in nature. And so, for political economic reasons, you have, movie studios. Rain Man does really well as a film, wins a bunch of awards, is well talked about. And then every other studio is like, we need to make our own Rain Man. So you get all these sort of copies, these spin-offs. And then, you have, many years later, you have something like I Am Sam. It hits again. And then you get another sort of rollout of these types of films. And so there's this sort of iterative nature to the ways in which we tell the story of disability in popular culture. And understanding that, as Baudrillard says, that the objective, I think, is not to get to the truth of disability, but rather the objective is to untangle some of this web, to untangle the dense ball that is disability. And I think that internet memes can help to get us in some ways to some of that content, help to see a little bit about not how a studio that is trying to present disability in a way in order to sell tickets, but how disability is used in some ways to try and tell your own story, to give depth, context, or meaning or emotion to an individual's experience as they share a meme on their timeline, or the ways that disability is used as a cudgel in some ways, the ways that disability is used to empower or disempower other people. So I think I'm really interested in a lot of the cognitive normative ideas that are wrapped up around Donald Trump, for instance, about the ways we talk about Donald Trump as degenerative cognitively. And we use cognitive impairment as a way to try and delegitimize Donald Trump as a president, which isn't me saying that Donald Trump is a legitimate president, but I think that there are actually a lot of things that have nothing to do with bodily or mental impairment that make him completely unfit for the position and the job.
Yeah, I mean, I similarly think the same way around Trump, but I always wonder about how they speak about his fat body, right, as like a moral failing, a predictor of his activity, right? And
Yeah.
I think, you know, you're unpacking of also how cognitive ableism or ableism around like capacity, right, is also very much a part of that discussion. I mean, sounds it sounds fantastic. It sounds very layered. I love when people talk about theory that I don't know and I'm introduced to it. So thank you for introducing me to a whole new area.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and doing it quite accessibly. So thank you for that.
I've been trying. I've been trying to get my students to read Baudrillard for several years now, and I'm shocked I'm still allowed to be a teacher because they are like, "Why are you making me read this? I am 20 years old. What is wrong with you?"
So I wonder if you could give us an example for those of us who don't know. Is there like a very popular meme that
So,
like, yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, oh yes. Well, so for those of you who do know me, this will come as no shock, but I have a low key obsession with a Torontonian that I know as Aubrey Graham, but many of you would know him by his other name, which is Drake, aka the Sixth God. And so
Is that his name?
well, he refers to himself as the Sixth God, yes.
Oh,
Um,
Lord.
Yes, among other things, Drizzy, of course,
Of course.
is a big one. OVO, October's very own. We could do you know what? Have me back for another episode, and we could do an
That's good.
entire Drake episode, because I have a lot to say. There's a lot to say. But I think Drake actually does give us a really great example. There's an article I'm working on literally right now as we speak, is about what was called the wheelchair Jimmy or wheelchair Drake meme.
Right.
So this meme was an image. It was actually a promotional shot for the TV show Degrassi: The Next Generation. So when Drake says "started from the bottom, now I'm here," that's what he was referring to. The bottom, Degrassi: The Next Generation. Not actually. He means he's from the quote unquote streets.
Yeah.
But we all know Degrassi is where he started. Anyways, so he was on the show Degrassi, and in the middle of Degrassi, they wanted a disabled character. My understanding is there was like an attempt to hire a disabled actor. The disabled actor didn't like the direction of the character, refused the role, said, "I would rather do it this way." And many of those plot points were then just transported over to Drake's character. And so Drake's character, Jimmy Brooks, is shot in the spine, and uses a wheelchair for the rest of his time on the show. Degrassi was trying to be very like current and modern and push the edges and talk about real people, and that was sort of their idea. But whether or not they succeeded is another conversation. But they had this promotional image of Aubrey Graham, young Aubrey Graham. He would have been about 17, 16, 17 at the time, sitting in a manual wheelchair on a basketball court. That image burst onto the internet for some reason around 2011, 2010, give or take. And it really confused a lot of Americans who weren't aware of his time on Degrassi. Average episode of Degrassi in the US was getting about a half a million viewers, give or take. So like, it was just under the million viewers sort of range. So not super popular in the US, right? So they were like, wait, why is Drake in a wheelchair? So the image itself went viral. And then from there, it then was quickly jumped on as a what we call a stock character macro, which is an internet meme in which a stock image is used. And then you've got top text, bottom text, that is usually done in sort of a specific kind of cadence. And so for the wheelchair Jimmy meme, we end up with a couple really interesting clusters. So the top text, bottom text typically are Drake lyrics that have been adapted to be about disability in some ways. Or Drake lyrics that have something to do with like being on a roll, that sort of time. So like there's one where he has a line where he's talking about how successful he is. And he says, "I'm floating in and out of consciousness." And they replace the word floating to rolling, for instance. So there's all these sort of memes that then were created playing with this idea of Drake in a wheelchair. When we start to look then at the clusters of how this meme was used, we start to see some really interesting themes. So, for instance, a lot of the memes that were made about Wheelchair Jimmy tend to be quotes, lyrics from Drake songs that are specifically like humble brags or bragging about his success. Um, so it's interesting that, as we do in many of our Drake memes, even outside of the Wheelchair Drake, there's a real interest in trying to like knock Drake down a peg to try and show him as not serious, not successful, not masculine, that he fails the challenge of masculinity, um, specifically the challenge of a black rapper masculinity, an American masculinity as well, specifically. But I think it's interesting to me that we are drawn then to this idea of using ideas of impairment as a means to delegitimize and to mock or satirize what is essentially a moment of him bragging about his ability, bragging about his powers as a rapper, his powers as like a business person, even his powers as a lover, as someone, a seductor, I was about to say seductress, which, but well, maybe we'll let Drake decide which he is. If he's an S or an er. But so that's one of the pieces. The other thing is that a lot of the lyrics are really tied and manipulated to talk about bodily loss. So it's a lot about not being able to walk, legs not working. So there's, for instance, someone's taken the pretty notorious quote from Jay-Z, I got 99 problems, and they've changed it. I've got 99 problems, but my legs are two. And so there's this real focus, this real energy that's poured into the legs specifically, which the irony, of course, is that in Wheelchair Jimmy's case, as a character, the disablement is actually a spinal cord injury. It's the spine that's broken, technically, not the legs, but semantics. But I think this actually starts to tell us some things, right, about the ways in which we imagine impairment, about the ways in which we see the wheelchair as emblematic of the broken legs that do not work. That is the root of disability, not just an embodied experience, but really tied to loss and brokenness. And I think that this actually connects really nicely with a French psychoanalyst named Julia Kristeva, who I have a lot of time for. And she writes about what she calls the narcissistic identity wound of disability. And she essentially says that in confronting the disabled subject, those who don't perceive themselves to be disabled see disability as an assault or an attack on their own sense of narcissistic self, their own sense of bodily completeness, their own sense of bodily supremacy, of ability, that it awakens this sort of deep anxiety within those who don't see themselves as disabled. And the response to that is disavowal. That the instinct is to identify the ways in which you and them are different, to draw hard lines between your subjectivity and they, the other. And in some ways, it connects in with her concept of the abject, which are these things that kind of lay at the borderlands of us and other, subject and object, somewhere between life and death, human and not human, where she believes that for those who see themselves as non-disabled, they then project a lot of these internal anxieties upon the disabled body. And I think that if we look at the Wheelchair Jimmy meme and the ways in which people use this to tell stories, the ways that they use it to talk about Drake, to create a concept of Drake through visual iconography and the merging of cleverly adapted or ironic or satirical song lyrics, we are not just given a story of who Drake is, but we're given a story that is deeply imbued with concepts of disablement that both naturalize our understanding of who the disabled are, namely physically disabled people using wheelchairs, and that this loss therefore limits an individual, not just their ability to walk, but their ability to be rich, powerful, successful, sexual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And of course, I think it is further complicated because Drake is a black man or a mixed race man, right? And what that says about who is creating these images and what words they're associating with it, and using his own lyrics, kind of just switched up a little bit in order to get their message across. I wonder if you know of any disabled people who've also taken the images but have done something different with it.
That is a really interesting question, which, as of right now, for this mimetic cluster itself, I have not been able to track down because it's old, and so I'm digging through a lot of old dead links, a lot of Internet Archive, and in 2012, this is such a weird thing to say, and words I never thought I would say. Back in 2012. We weren't actually very good at citing creators of memes.
Right.
And now in 2020, we actually are. It's a lot easier now to backtrack where things come from because there are people like me who are interested in these things. And so it's actually becoming a lot easier. This meme is a little bit old. It's a little harder to do that work. Having said that, the broader question, I think, then becomes, what's the difference between the ways in which mimetic ephemera is used by disabled people to tell their story versus the ways that non-disabled people are using it as either a platform to make jokes, a platform to share emotion. In my, I'm going to say, very limited experience, even though I spend most of my life in social worlds online, because I'm a nerd. But in my experience, a lot of disabled people use memes as vehicles for radical embodiments, for radical statements on the world, around justice, around themselves. It shows really the ways in which mimetic content has a real multiplicity to them. That the vehicles are the pathways in which ideologies can be shared and spread virally from in groups to out groups. And so while the vehicle may be the same, the content becomes radically different, which should be of no surprise to us. The question, though, is who is more successful? Which story gets told more often? And when we look at content that goes viral online when it comes to disability, virality is tethered deeply to questions of injustice, questions of loss, and questions of inspiration. Tends to be that which motivates the share, so to speak.
So interesting. I'm so glad you're doing this work. I mean, it feels very of the moment, but it's still very much tied to kind of the history of the discipline, and tied to this. I think what you said before, it's like these are different ways of telling stories, and with them being shared more widely and faster than ever before, critical analysis of them is still very much essential, even though we can probably read them, swipe past them, and never see them again, right? But doesn't mean they don't live on in our memories. It doesn't mean they don't live on or impact the people who are reading them or viewing them. And of course, some people are creating them, right? So it's like, what is the intention behind that? That's so fantastic.
Absolutely. And I think the challenge of memes is that I would argue, leading up into the early 2000s, I think many scholars that were working in the world of disability studies and many activists in the world of disability studies were looking at media and saying, well, the solution here is policy, that we need to get into Hollywood and get them to start hiring disabled actors and writers and directors. We need to get into TV studios and we need to pitch stories about disability. And I think many of those efforts were largely successful, sometimes either directly successful, something like I'm thinking ABC's Speechless, for instance, which would be, I would say, a great example of activism pushing through policy and bureaucracy in order to get alternate views and alternate opinions on the quote unquote airwaves, to sort of unintentional things like Peter Dinklage, Game of Thrones, for instance. Peter Dinklage's career in general, you could argue, in some ways, where it's like the groundwork was laid for someone like Peter Dinklage to kind of burst through the membrane, and become a thing, which is great. Internet memes are way harder to manage. There is no central agency for us to go to and say, hey, the way that you're telling stories about us is not just rooted in this hyper real imagination of disablement, this sort of layered representation of what it's like to be disabled, but also you're perpetualizing and naturalizing this fiction by doing so. And you should probably do better. And also, you have a financial reason to want to do better. With the world of internet memes, there is no central body. There is no, there are not the same levers that can be pulled in order to try and move things forward in a fairly quick way. In that way, I think we need to be thinking about digital culture, digital ephemera now, and working on it now. How is it growing? How does it spread? What is animating these discourses? Because that is the tool we're going to need when it comes time to start to confront it head on. Because many of the efforts so far to confront ableism in online community, online culture, digital culture in particular, memes, for instance, have been horrendous failures. And so, for instance, there was an old internet meme of a young girl. A photo was taken from Facebook of a young woman who has Down syndrome. And it was put on a pinwheel background, and it was just sort of making fun of people with Down syndrome, essentially. 10 years later, when the child is now a teenager, her and her mom start a campaign to try and eliminate that meme from the internet.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, the Streisand fact happens, and now there are two memes about this woman. There's the meme of her as a child in a pinstripe, and now there are memes based on her as a teenager that's been sort of blended and like bound up with internet content around feminism, hating feminists, the aggrieved feminist sort of thing. And so it's like in trying to fight it, there's just been like this reopening of the womb and the perpetuation of the original idea. As I said, this is the Streisand effect par excellence. And so we're not going to overcome this by saying no. We're not going to overcome this by saying don't. To take a phrase from Cale Lasson, my second reference to Adbusters in this podcast now, which is weird. Cale Lasson said that, Adbusters' idea was about media jinjitsu, that the way to fight ideology is to capture the energy of the ideology that's coming at you, pivot it, and send it back in the other direction. And so for him, it was about parody of advertisements to try and drain that mythical status of ads. I think we need to start to consider the ways in which we can do a similar mimetic jinjitsu to try and capture that real visceral energy and emotion and, like, dare I say, passion that's driving a lot of this mimetic content, and start to help it to start to channel it into other places. And for that, I think we need to demystify and unmask the simulacra, that these aren't true. It's are merely copies of copies of copies.
Wonderful. So let's jump right into segment 2, what I like to call the middle or the liminal. And I guess I want to know, who is your academic crush? Who can you not stop reading or recommending?
Oh, that is like the meanest question I think I've ever received. That is like cruel. That's a cruel question. Who is my academic crush? Oh man. I've already shouted out Kristeva. I've already shouted out Baudrillard. Okay, so I'm gonna go way back. Let's go way back. This isn't even disability studies, um, but I'm gonna go way back. Let's do a shout out to Althusser, Louis Althusser, my boy. Um, you know it. I think Althusser is a really interesting character as one of those sort of Marxist writers from the a long time ago now, well, especially long ago in COVID era, like 2-3 centuries ago, by our current time system. But Althusser, there's something really charming about the ways that Althusser writes. I'm really drawn still to this day around the way he writes about interpolation and ideology as it operates in society. Obviously, he was very much a structuralist, writing kind of right out of that sort of Marxist tradition. But I think Althusser deserves a little more love in disability studies.
No contemporary like disability studies scholar that you, besides yourself, maybe that uses Althusser that you think is like worthy?
No,
reading?
I think that's my problem.
Okay.
I'm putting everyone on blast. Putting everyone on blast. I think that there's so many things that where we talk about like passing, for instance, and we talk about some of the, and I'm like, oh man, like this is interpolation, like this is the ideology of normalcy hailing us, and being like, hey, are you normal? Yeah, you are normal, aren't you? This is totally interpolation in some ways, and subjugation as a result. And so
I'm definitely gonna have to look into it then. So.
it's a deep cut, and it's also something you can find for free on internet because the Marxists are great at getting their stuff online for free. So a simple search will get you access. Yeah, but it's a weird one, I suppose. I apologize.
It is the oldest reference or the oldest academic crush we've had so far. So
really, I should have really. Well, you know that Nietzsche guy has some good ideas. I think he might catch on.
And some really bad ideas.
mostly bad ideas. Yeah.
All right. What advice do you have for young academics or even students who who are kind of in the game now?
Yeah. So this is probably a little bit counterintuitive given that I teach in a disability studies program. Sorry to anyone that's listening that runs graduate programs in disability studies. So once you've gotten your undergraduate in disability studies at King's, I would recommend that I would love to see young academics taking disability studies and just battering down the doors of other disciplines. I would love to see disability studies continue to be seeded in other disciplines, in other worlds. I want to see disability studies blowing up the world of psychology. I want to see disability studies in the world of geography. I want to see disability studies in history. I want to see it. It's very much already in English. I want to see it in computer science. I want to see it in engineering. So I think this isn't an advice. It's a plea, perhaps, that once you are really comfortable in the world of disability studies, take that tool and literally, like those old days in Berkeley, go and start chiseling out the curb cuts into these other faculties, into these other disciplines. I think that's better for the world in a lot of ways. And I think that you will be surprised at how open and accepting and interested other disciplines are. Because I think that we have, crested that debate where I think a lot of programs are now realizing, wow, yeah, it's been like 400 or 500 years of this discipline, and we've never talked about disabled people. Maybe it's time. I think that we're getting past that now. So that's my advice: is get out there, get interdisciplinary. It will, if nothing else, give you something else to think about, I think. And let the disability studies get your heart and blood flowing, and then use the other discipline to tear down the world.
I mean, I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, I think being a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, someone who studies multiple disciplines is fantastic. I do think they will be open to doing disability studies. I just don't know how accessible they'll be. So
that is another question. That's it. I think there are a lot of people out there who don't have the spoons to go out there and to fight the fights. But if you are a person who does,
exactly.
blaze that trail.
Yeah, perfect. All right, segment 3, I call this outside the research, the work, the project, the art. Who is the most famous person you've met, and what was that experience like?
Oh, Lord. Okay, so do you want like a good answer or do you want a hilarious answer?
I think we need to laugh. Let's go with hilarious.
Okay, so so back in 1992.
Oh wow, deep cut. Another deep cut.
Another deep cut. Yep. So back in 1992, I was a young lad, and I was a young lad who found himself at a Toronto Maple Leafs game at the Gardens, and I was a young lad who, had a wheelchair, wanted to meet some peeps, and managed to get himself into the Toronto Maple Leafs dressing room after the game, in which I got to meet all of my idols in various states of undress. I don't know, for those of you who are not into like sports culture or whatever, locker rooms, I understand now, are very much like a clothing optional situation, clothing frowned upon, perhaps even situation. So I got a real intimate education on, Doug Gilmour, Wendell Clark, a lot of these like Leaf greats as a young boy. And so not only did I get to meet a lot of Toronto Maple Leafs, I also got to meet them naked, which is something else entirely.
That is something else, yes.
Yeah, something else entirely. And I'm still a Leaf fan. And I was horrified that Doug Gilmour didn't have cow legs, because at the time he was doing these commercials for the Milk Canada people. And so he had those commercials where his legs were painted like a cow's legs. And I did not know that was paint, I guess, as a child. And I was like, oh, because I thought he was maybe really good at hockey because he was like part cow, because cows are strong, right? So I was like, oh, that makes sense. So like my dreams, I guess, were crushed. I realized that Doug Gilmour was not some sort of cow centaur, but just a naked man who I met.
That is funny. And also poor like 10-year-old you. Like, so
it's a very odd situation, right? Like it's like the 90s were a different time, right? Sure. They were like, oh, you're a young child? Yeah, come on in. It's all good. We're all friends here. It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. But yeah.
What obscure fact do you carry around and pull out in uncomfortable silences?
Oh, obscure fact. Oh, man. That is also a really hard question to answer. Obscure fact. Do I know any obscure fact? Every fact I know, I feel, is not obscure. I guess, okay. So as I said, I'm a real big fan of Drake. A fan is not the right word, I guess. Obsession, perhaps, is a better word. There's love and hate, I think, at the same time. So an obscure thing about Drake that is really interesting is that, did you know that, so not only does Drake have a house beside Kanye's. So he bought a house beside Kanye's house in Hollywood, or LA, wherever they're, Malibu. I don't know. Who cares? Wherever the rich people are. So he's there. He, in his backyard, has like a fully functional basketball court, which has cameras. And Kanye and Drake have like games they play against each other on this court. And Drake apparently records these games and then he makes supercuts apparently of like his best shots. And so there's this amazing YouTube video. So Ninja from Die Antwoord, I think I'm saying that right, Die Antwoord. If you go to YouTube, there's a great video. If you look up Ninja banana pudding, and it's all about the day that Ninja spent with Kanye, and then they go and play basketball against Drake. And it is a whole thing. And in what I often say to myself whenever I learn something about Drake having a highlight reel of his best shots that he made in his backyard is the most Drake thing that I've ever heard.
Absolutely.
It makes so much sense.
It makes so much sense. And that is an incredibly obscure fact. I thought you were going to tell us something about his new house in Post Road or Bridle Path or that. I mean,
oh no, it's all deep cuts here. We're nostalgia. This is your nostalgia episode.
Very deep cuts, yes. Okay. What are you reading now? What's on your bedside table?
So this is, and again, more evidence of how bad I am as a professor. So I got one of my students to read Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. So I am rereading Anti-Oedipus right now and really enjoying it way more than I did when I had to read it for comprehensive exams. So I've been reading that, and that's been good. And I'm low-key a really big fan of John Scalzi, who's a science fiction writer. And so in about a week and a half, I will be reading his new book, Last Emperix, which is the third novel in his Collapsing Empire trilogy. And actually, shout out to John Scalzi. If you want to read a book that sounds like a DS book that was not written by someone in DS, check out John Scalzi's book, Lock In. It is a sci-fi noir mystery, and it is like, I use it in one of my classes because it is like disability studies come alive. And as far as I know, John Scalzi has no background in disability studies, which is pretty amazing. Right. So shout out to Scalzi and Deleuze and Guattari. Yeah, definitely.
Do you have a hobby or something that you like to do that brings you joy? And how did you get started?
Yeah, well, so those are two interesting questions. My original answer, and then you're like, brings you joy, and I was like, oh, I don't know.
I had
to. Does it bring me joy?
I had to add that because Jenna Reed politicized the word hobby for us at some point during this podcast, and so I've been told to both include hobby, but also some people don't have hobbies, and also maker cultures, when people are doing actual work, are turned into hobbies. So that's why.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So my hobby, which I guess have a love-hate relationship with, I'm huge. I love video games. I'm really deep into video games. Love it. Very sad during the year when I can't really play video games because I'm marking and doing all the academic work. But there's just something beautiful about loading up NHL and just knowing that you just eviscerated like a 12-year-old. Like there's just no better feeling. And there's no better reality check than when the 12-year-old completely humiliates you, just destroys you. And you're like, right, I am not a god among men. I am but a mortal. And that's okay. But it is, I would say, a love-hate relationship. But I think video games are a great outlet. And I started video gaming when I was really young. Deep cut again, I suppose, when I was about 6 years old. I'd had a surgery couldn't go out and play. And so my parents allowed me to get my first Nintendo, and to sort of pass the time as I was recovering. And it really stuck. I loved the fact that if I went out and played baseball or hockey with the friends on my street where I grew up, I wasn't really playing with them. The rules had to be changed, and the adaptation just wasn't the same. And if I scored, it really didn't count because it was kind of, they allowed it to happen. That there wasn't that competitiveness. But in the video game world, in the digital sphere, I was able to compete on a level that was no different than anyone else.
Yeah.
There was nothing more satisfying than when I started playing competitively on a video game called Counter-Strike many years ago. And the first time that I was like viciously, horrendously, sexistly trash talked by an opposing player. And I was like, your acceptance means so much to me. Thank you, sir. Also, what you just said was like vile, but I appreciate that you feel that I was worthy of such an atrocious, awful thing to say to another person. I was so thankful. It was amazing. I was like, no, please tell me more what you will do to my mother. I would love to know. Thank you, sir. Because I never had that before. Like, no one's going to trash talk the kid in the wheelchair. Like, that's wild. And so there was a really interesting kind of acceptance there that I enjoyed. And then that got old real quick. Don't be a weird sexist racist on the internet, guys. Just chill with that. Just play the game, shake hands after. It's all good. Win or lose. Have fun. That's the name of the game.
I want to know how you think disability can save the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, like, legitimately from like the deepest part of my soul, is something that I do legitimately believe. I think that, like a lot of disability studies scholars have said, I think that disability actually is an important key that is going to unlock the next, I don't want to say the next phase of humanity, the next way of being, but I think that disability opens up and reveals the cracks of neoliberal capitalist um, schemes in ways that I don't think other theory has been quite as able to articulate and to reveal just the complete bankruptcy of some of these political and economic philosophies. I think that disability reveals to us that we didn't beat eugenics back in the end of World War II, that we vilified the word, we did not eliminate the ideology, that we do still have this dark desire for a perfected human body, and we are okay with getting rid of those who don't align with that principle. I think disability then asks us to question, so what is that other side? If we're not going to be a eugenic society, if we're not going to be a society that strives to build a monolithic, perfected, normal human, then what do we want to be? And I think that where the eugenic path takes us not just down a dark road, but down a very monolithic road, a very sort of centered, singular road, that disability opens us up to this like deep root system that weaves out into the sand that actually grounds us in a way to survive the heavy winds and the cold winters. I think that by thinking about diverse ability, diverse function, diverse configurations of the human, as seen not just through the disabled body, quote unquote, as defined by medicine, but as seen by the human body as an imperfect body, as a multiple, fractured, weird, vulnerable, fragile body, that suddenly the possibilities of the future become so much more exciting and so much more interesting to say, who cares about building a world for one kind of person? Think about the beautiful world of many and how many people can come up with many more ideas, with many more perspectives, with many more pathways forward. That diversity genuinely is the spice of life in some ways. But diversity also gives us the answers on how to answer questions that perhaps we can't answer right now. I would be horrified if we lived in a world that only operated under one economic philosophy as we enter into the COVID crisis. That different ways of tackling this problem gives us a lot closer to exiting this crisis, I would say, not just in terms of medical research, but in terms of how can we structure our society to be safer? How can we structure our work world to be more accommodating? How can we structure our lives to be more healthy? And what does health mean? What does health look like? I think what's amazing right now in light of the COVID-19 pandemic is the ways in which people are now redefining what healthy is, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm going to snack because I'm just trying to survive this. I don't need to stick to my rigid sort of diet structure that has been determined as getting me the right body for swimsuit season. We start to remember that there are things that are maybe more important in our lives than going to the job, getting the money, eating the right food, doing the right exercise, building the right body, building the right life. Because that maybe was also simulacra all along, perhaps. Just a copy of a copy, a representation passed off as natural. And I think disability is the key to opening up that conversation. I think that loss and difference seen through the lens of disability opens up this type of conversation, which before this didn't happen because I think we all thought everything was great. Like, oh, society is perfect. I'm a normate. Things are great. And that's not so anymore.
To hear you talk about disability, in absolute relationship with the future, right, and what's possible in the future is, to me, like really compelling. It's really why I think I wanted to start the podcast in the beginning, right, to hear what people had to say, and to hear you articulate this idea that disability can show us a new path forward, and also to really reveal the current path we're on, right, in terms of eugenics is, I think, a really powerful statement. Thank you for sharing that.
No, absolutely. I'm excited. Like, I know a lot of people are really worried. And like, obviously it's going to be bad when I die from COVID, but provided I don't, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the future. I don't see how the world can go back to how it was before this. I think that would be quite difficult. And beyond that, I think we disabled people are becoming more powerful, more articulate, more connected, more out of the house than ever before, which to me, I love that there's that sort of sticker that's going around, a meme in and of its own right, that's like, the future is accessible. I think it was Robert McGruer. He did this Jasper Poir. I don't remember. I apologize to whoever I'm about to quote, and Google it and find out who. That's the mystery of this podcast. Find out who said the future will be crip. I'm 90% sure it was Robert McGruer who said the future will be crip. And to me, I'm like, yeah, dude.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's all just get disabled and get weird with it. It'll be awesome.
And there's no better way to end than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And I'm sorry to everyone who listened to this.
No.
Thanks again to Jeff for coming on the show. Get in touch by sending us an email at disabilitysavestheworld@gmail.com. If you're interested in learning more about me, you can check out my website, félixshinuda.com. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, and now edited by Yasmina Garcia. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Disability Saves the World.